Welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is T.W. Walsh, and if you're not familiar with him, he is an American songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, record producer, mixing engineer, and mastering engineer. He was a member of the group Pedro the Lion for many years and has since gone on to start many other projects of his own. These days, you'll typically find him doing a lot of mastering work where he's worked with artists such as Gibbard of Death Cab for Cutie, Nathaniel Rateliff, Clap Your Hands and Say Yeah, The Shins, Sufjan Stevens, Cold War Kids, and so many more. And in today's episode, we have a really great chat all about the process of mastering. And TW is very, very articulate with defining his process and why he makes the decisions that he does. And I think he says some things in this interview that sound kind of counterproductive for people who are inexperienced in this industry. One of the most notable things that he says near the end of the episode is how you don't always want to master each song to sound the absolute best it can. And I think that is a very interesting statement to make. And so you'll totally understand why he says that at the end of this episode. But I think that he comes to this with a fresh approach. And I think that it's something that the experienced mastering engineers fully understand. But for the inexperienced person, some of the stuff might seem counterproductive. So in this episode, I think you're going to learn a lot from it because he's very articulate with his answers and he's very intentional about why he does what he does. And he explains that really well in this episode. So if you've ever been curious about the mastering process and what goes into it, and ultimately what pro mastering engineers are listening for, I think you're going to learn a lot in this episode. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. T.W. Walsh, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Mike.
Awesome. For people who might not be familiar with you or your background, can you give us a little bit of that background on who you are, what you do, and how you got into everything you're currently working on?
Yeah, sure. I'm an audio engineer, producer, and an artist as well. I'm a songwriter. I've been in several bands as a multi-instrumentalist. So my whole life has been about music and technology and creativity. And so that's kind of how I found my way into doing this stuff.
Awesome. So how did you, obviously you said you started as a musician, but what ultimately got you into that technical side of things? What was that transition like for you?
Yeah, it was kind of a DIY mentality. I grew up in an era where it was, we were still dealing with analog recording technology, digital technologies existed, but they weren't consumer products yet, And so I was in bands from the time I was about 12 years old, playing drums, making original music, writing songs and stuff like that. So, you want to document your progress and kind of have something to listen to. So it just started kind of sticking a boombox with a cassette recorder in the middle of the room during band practice and recording that. And then just from there, it was just kind of random that one of my buddies, his older brother, happened to have a cassette 4-track, because he was into synthesizers and samplers and stuff like that and recording music. And so we kind of would steal the 4-track when he wasn't looking and started messing with overdubs and things like that, which was kind of mind-blowing. The concept was tough for us to wrap our heads around. And so, yeah, from there, it just kind of grew, once we had the capacity to record and layer music, we kind of wanted to keep taking it to the next level. And we got to have some experience in recording studios locally in Massachusetts. I think at a certain point, ADATs came along, so we could afford to get into one of these ADAT 8-track studios when I was about 14 or 15 or something, and then started seeing this is how you can do it if you have multiple microphones and, there's a mixing board involved and things like that. And so it just kind of kept going from there, Yeah, it was kind of mind blowing seeing all this stuff set up. And then, when I was in college, it just kind of grew from there to where I would own, reel-to-reel 8-track machines and borrow gear and get into slightly better studios and start picking the brain of the engineer that was working there. And it was just, I was usually the one that was most curious about the technical stuff. And then also if you're recording a record, I was playing drums in a lot of those early projects. So like you get the drum tracks down and then you're kind of like hanging around the rest of the time while people do their overdubs. So I got to sit on the couch and watch like everything unfold and kind of learn about what was happening,
It's very cool. So with your interest in the technical side of it, did you foresee yourself getting into the technical side as a career, or was it more just like a means of like just documenting the music that you were making?
I was really just interested in the creative process and like making stuff, and it didn't occur to me that it could be a career or was an option really at all until maybe late into college, where like recording schools started popping up in Boston and stuff like that. And like I'd hear about people going to the Berkeley, production and engineering programs and stuff like that. But it was purely like out of the love of making stuff. At a certain point I started thinking about like going to school and doing that, but it was, I don't know. I think I didn't allow my brain to go there really with my aspirations. And there really wasn't a lot of information about how to get into a career like that. Even if you went to a school, I would hear stories like about people having a tough time finding internships and getting jobs and stuff like that. So it was like a different world in the 90s, really, pre-internet, and it was a much more analog world where communication, networking, information, it was all about different. It was all different than what we have now. And then it was also like a transitional phase too. It wasn't the golden era of recording studios either. You know what I mean? So a lot was changing in the industry. And I was just kind of focused more on academics as far as like a career. I came from like a blue collar background. So I had this like DIY and kind of hardworking mentality. And then you go into school studying mechanical engineering and computer science. Like I didn't really start connecting the dots that like all of this could be woven into a career. I had kind of a limited idea of what that could look like,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it also sounds too that you were establishing yourself as an artist as well. So, if you're performing and stuff like that and networking within that circle of people, then, you could transition this into something where you can make some money and work with other artists. It sounds like you got into studios really young and you were observing it really young. So, and doing a lot of that trial and error very early too. So, it kind of makes sense. Maybe the school route wasn't the right place for you. Yeah,
that's a good point. Like, first off, like the technical stuff, like learning how to do this stuff, it was always in service of like my creative pursuits, making the music, and like it was a shortcut or a way to control or conserve expenses by doing it ourselves. But it was in the service of being an artist. But then, yeah, you're right. Like I kind of had a lot of experience early on already that I wasn't sure that I wasn't sure that I was going to get that ROI, that return on investment of like going to a recording school. Like I knew how to set up mics. I knew how to like, wire a studio and operate a tape machine and things like that. So yeah, in retrospect, like it seems like all the pieces make sense. But back then when I was in it, it was a bit chaotic, and I had my priorities were just to like be in a band. That was mainly be in a band and like not fail out of school. Those were kind of the things that I was worried about in the 90s,
Yeah, of course. Do you remember your first like paid project that you did and like what got you, what made you feel like I'm ready to take this on? Because a lot of people just like, they'll tinker on their own stuff forever and they nitpick so much and they just are like almost like they're just intimidated to like ask someone to like pay them for their services. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that what happened was, I became known in my friend circle as a guy who knew how to do this stuff, and I had like some of the equipment and everything. So instead of like offering my services, I had people coming to me to help them like solve some problem or finish their project or somehow prepare their music for distribution. Like I started getting into real DIY mastering as soon as it became affordable to buy like external CD-R drives, like for computers. There was a primitive technology called SCSI, which was a way to send like data at high speeds to peripheral devices, but it's very, very archaic now. But like back then, because I was comfortable with the technology stuff and computers and stuff, like I got my hands on, I was the first person that I knew that could just burn a CD. You know what I mean? So people started coming to me just in my friend group and my peers, and like I would be doing favors, and I kind of helped people just for fun for a long time. And then my first project where there was some kind of real compensation was there was a local guy who owned like a guitar shop, and he offered me like this, this vintage Fender Mustang guitar to master. I don't remember if I was mixing or mastering something, but like help him finish a record. And so that trade was the kind of the first thing where I was like, oh, like I can do this for trade, and maybe I can like start to get paid once in a while for doing this. And the main idea was just to kind of like subsidize my gear costs, because I was always like trying to upgrade things, or, it's expensive to do this. Like, even if you're not, just to own the equipment you need to do this stuff, and to be able to keep it up to date every 5 years, like do some upgrades. Like I've been losing money from the get-go just due to gear acquisition syndrome. So I was like, oh, maybe I can kind of like, pay for some of the gear I need by doing this. And so, just word spreads, word of mouth, and so I started getting paid a little bit here and there. And then as soon as like the internet was really mainstream, that's kind of where it turned into more of a business, where people could send me files to work on, whether that was mixing or mastering. And so that was like in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, where it just became a lot easier to like work remotely and or even like receive a zip disk in the mail, these types of things,
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were doing a lot more mixing work at the beginning, right?
Yeah, mastering for a long time, it seemed like a black art, like it was like kind of the last frontier of things that like only the professionals do, And I think even with digital audio back then, in general, there wasn't a lot of information. With analog, like you could really, it was only like, you were only worried about what it sounded like, and you use your ears. There were VU meters and things like that, but you knew that even when you clipped or hit the red, that it still could sound cool. I think in the digital domain, there was a lot of like unknowns. It was when it came to bit depth and resolution, there was a lot of confusion as to what are the absolute rules here. And even like when it came to digital clipping, and this is at the peak of the Loudness wars and stuff like that. And the information just wasn't available, so I learned by trial and error, like learning. I had to read a lot and experiment a lot with digital audio to know what the limits were and what the boundaries were, and how to go about mastering a record. And so I was largely self-taught, but I had stayed away from it for so long because digital audio was still kind of, it was a little scary to us amateurs. You know what I mean? Like it felt like science, and we didn't want to like set the lab on fire or something. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, you were mainly running an analog setup at that point, and just kind of seeing that digital was on the horizon, and at some point you would make that migration, I guess. But
I was working in the analog domain, and I would mix into the computer and then do some mastering in there. So like my mixing platform was Cool Edit Pro at first. It was like this, one of the first kind of easily accessible stereo audio programs,
That was my first DAW as well.
Oh,
so I'm very
nice.
familiar with it.
Nice. So, it wasn't even multi-track at that point. It was like, wow, it went to stereo. You know what I mean? So the green waveforms on the black background, I'll never forget that. But, it also became over time, mixing is really labor intensive. There's lots of revisions typically. Everybody in the band has got to make sure that their instrument is loud enough. And so there's a lot of back and forth. And then also over time, bands and artists were doing their own mixes, and they were looking more for somebody to like fix any of the deficiencies in the final product and kind of like put their stamp of approval on it. So that's kind of what people started asking me to do more mastering than mixing. And I think that was just kind of a trend in the DIY, music industry, that mastering was still something that people were afraid of. And I had just graduated to that a little bit. And so that's kind of what I started focusing on. I'm trying to remember when I started really doing more mastering, but it was like in the mid 2000s probably, or something like that. Late 2000s.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but with that transition from digital, and seeing kind of like, the loudness wars and all that stuff that was going on at that time. When I was doing my research on you, I did find this article that was really interesting where you were being interviewed, and you were talking about your mastering process and loudness in general. And I'm assuming you were talking about kind of this point in time. But there was a quote from you that said that in the beginning, I hated having to make things loud. It seemed destructive to me. Over time, I got more skilled and more flexible with how far I was willing to take things. And I was curious to know, like, can you elaborate on kind of what that destructiveness was that you found when you're turning things up? Like, and does that still apply today?
Yeah, good question. It doesn't apply as much today, especially since like Spotify, they're actually normalizing audio downwards. Typically, they actually reduce the volume of mastered tracks when they come in. But back then, you'd want to maximize. Everything was on a CD, and you'd want to maximize the volume so that this is like the days of CD changers, like you would have, you'd buy these CD players that had like 12 discs that they could play in them, and you'd put 12 CDs in there and you hit shuffle.
I still have a 6-disc CD player in my car.
Yeah, me too. And you've been listening to the same 6 discs probably for 10 years. I
change them maybe like once every year and a half or something like that. Yeah. just one of them,
So I really think this is kind of what drove the whole thing, was that people were still listening to physical media, and even at the beginning of like iTunes, shuffling and playlists and things were starting to become a thing. So everybody wanted to be competitive in listening volume if your music was being played on shuffle. So as a mastering engineer during that era, people would always be comparing what you did to the loudest record they own. You know what I mean? And they would say, It's got to be louder. It's got to be louder. And as an artist and as a mixing engineer, like when I was working on a song and working on an album, when I finished the mix, that's what I wanted it to sound like. I wanted it to come back, maybe louder, but I wanted to, in mastering, I wasn't looking for them to change the sonics really of what I was doing. And so I would have these mixes coming in, and at times maybe it wasn't to my taste, or it was a genre that wasn't my favorite, but I always would try to respect what the mixing engineer and the vision of the artist was, and so my assumption was always that like they liked how it sounded, and they didn't want to change it that much unless they said that to me. So when I found myself having to get these mixes up into insanely loud territory, the only way to do that is by really, ruining the dynamics, like the macro dynamics and the micro dynamics. A lot of alternative rock music has got like quiet verses and loud choruses, and so as you kind of like hit the limiter harder and harder, not only do the transient sound worse, and as an engineer, this, like everything starts the macro dynamics of the song changes, like the kind of emotional impact from section to section changes. So I didn't like introducing the unpleasant distortion and changing the dynamic so extremely in the mixes I was getting. Over time, I really refined the techniques that I could live with, like whether that was certain types of clipping or, finding limiter settings that gave me kind of compression characteristics, so I didn't have to do 2 stages of kind of gain control and gain reduction. And so, over time, I just got better at using different techniques, and some of the tools got better. Like over time, like the in the box tools in particular got super refined to where you could do lots of different kinds of multi-band limiting and really different kinds of transparent clipping and stuff like that. So that's what I was talking about when I wrote that response. But over time, because the distribution channels have now started, like I said, manipulating the input that we're giving them, so that they're taking care of that for us. So now we can preserve a lot more of the dynamics, like with the LUFS standard, and like -14 is kind of the RMS that Spotify uses. So we can kind of like ease up on that quite a bit and really respect the mixes more and more. I'm finding though that like still there are clients out there who need to be kind of educated on the state of digital audio and streaming and stuff. So there's still some confusion out there as to like how important it is to make something loud.
Of course. Well, yeah, I was curious about that because obviously, these different streaming services, they all have their recommendations for how loud things should be, or I guess what they're gonna normalize all the volumes to. And I was curious to know like how that impacted the work that you were doing, because it seems like most of the big records that are getting distributed, people still aren't submitting things at -14 LUFS. They're still giving them significantly louder. And so it's kind of like for a lot of people who are newer to the scene, they see that Spotify says -14 and they think that that's the standard that they need to hit. But yet all these professionals are still going way above that. So I was curious to like get your input on that, and, how you're approaching your masters at this point. And, do you care about that -14, or is it just kind of a thing that you just deal with?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it has to do with taste, like because we were conditioned for 25 years that like dynamics and transients sound a certain way on the records that we've been listening to for the last since the early 2000s or late 90s. There's that sound to records, like the digital clipping and the reduced dynamic range. To a certain extent, that just becomes the taste and what everybody's used to listening to. So I think a lot of like engineers and producers from a certain generation, or certain people working in genres where the standards were defined by that generation, like anything that has guitars in it is going to harken back to what was happening, in alternative rock, essentially, like totally. in the 90s, right? So that is kind of the sound of that type of music to a lot of people. So I think that is what drives that mentality still. It's like a taste thing.
For sure. And in those styles of music, like those heavier rock styles, like, if we're talking about LUFS, those are often in like the, -8 or -6, right, in that range there, right?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so, sometimes mixing engineers, producers, they mix into like, the Sonox limiter or like the waves, whatever it is, and just because it's part of their sound and they want to get the sound of the transients that way. And so that's totally respectable. That's just the sound they're going for, and so but the reality is like that when Spotify processes that, it's gonna bring that down 6 dB, or whatever it is. So But it's beside the point. They're going for that sound, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like you're kind of just, it's still just taking that old school way of thinking about mastering and just letting the digital distributors do it, whatever they need to do to make people get consistent audio, I guess.
Yeah. In my opinion, like a lot of what I'm doing, it's either like, sometimes it's one-off singles, but a lot of the times if it's an album, there are different distribution channels that we're worried about. Like a lot of the records I do, that there is going to be a vinyl version, you know what I mean? And so like a lot of the mastering considerations are geared more towards having a high quality vinyl master. And you kind of got to like even out the difference. Sometimes once in a while, I'll get an artist that wants to do like one vinyl master that has no limiting, no compression whatsoever, and just, you know, like to get it as pure as possible. But usually it's like you're trying to kind of even out all of the different considerations for different distribution channels, you know?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So then ultimately in the end, like, how do you know how loud to make a track? Like, is it just kind of a feel thing for you at that point, or?
So these days I aim, I mean, it really depends on the dynamic range of the tracks that I'm getting, right? So like a lot of times, the mixes I get are already, maybe they're like -10 LUFS or something like that. And so I don't want to give them back something that's quieter necessarily. You know what I mean? But I would say I try to beat that -14 standard. And then I say to the artist, like, you know, Spotify's probably going to turn this down. This is a healthy loudness, whether it's, you know, -12 or even -10 that I end up with, because the transients were already really controlled, let's say, in the mix that I got. So I just try to beat that standard a little bit so that it's still a little bit competitive if they're comparing it to other files on their computer. But I try to educate them that this is going to be normalized and brought down in the distribution channels anyway. So I really appreciate that it's more about what it sounds like these days than how loud it is ultimately. But like I said, the education level for artists and stuff is not always there. And you could even, you're not comparing apples to apples on your MacBook either if you're listening to masters back, because you might be listening to this song in Spotify and, you know, something I sent you just in the Finder preview with QuickTime, or it might be in iTunes. So it's I think it's complex to monitor an A/B for artists when they're getting back mixes and masters and they're thinking about volume. So it's
that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Because if you're listening on Spotify, you're hearing that kind of codec applied to it, and you know, although it's technically quieter depending on, you know, what's going on in your Spotify settings, it might sound louder. You know,
exactly, exactly. So it's really tough, I think, for artists to even know what they're getting back sometimes beyond just the sonic quality. If they're thinking about volume, I just hope that kind of becomes less and less relevant over time as we get like higher data transfer speeds. We can get higher and higher quality audio, and we have more and more headroom with like 32-bit audio and stuff, you know?
For sure. Yeah, it's kind of interesting because it's like, to some degree, it almost is like the opposite of the loudness wars to some degree on Spotify, where it's like, you know, they're saying like, we're turning things down, you know, instead of like everything getting louder, but there still are those people working from that loudness war perspective. And so it's just like this really interesting in-between time where I think there's just a lot of, like there's programmers and then there's the audio engineers, and they're not really communicating with each other very well.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time for these different mediums to kind of really reach a saturation point and for people to really understand what's happening. But when I was a kid, the format was vinyl, right? And then it was cassette, and that was my format as somebody coming into their own as a music lover was cassette. And then it was CD, and then it was like MP3s that you could consume. And now we basically have full resolution, whatever, 24, 44, 1 kind of audio with a lot of the codecs that we have now. But like all of these formats still exist, and there's periods of time where they're all coexisting, and I think we have to live with all of them, and it's it can be messy if you're working on the technical side, and confusing if you're an artist or a consumer. Just like, what are the differences between all of these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the safe. The reassuring thing is that if you go too loud, you're still safe. They're going to turn it down. If you're too quiet, they're going to turn it up. So, from that sense, it's just like make it sound as good as it can and just trust that the other side of it will even it out for you.
Yeah, the distribution channels are the great equalizer. They're going to it's up to them ultimately.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I guess still having that old school way of thinking about, making everything loud, that still applies if people are going to be making physical CDs and that kind of stuff. Because, presumably someone who's buying a CD to begin with already has a CD collection at this point. And so when they're flipping between their 6 CD CD player, then they're going to notice the differences in volumes if one's way quieter than the other. But I guess,
yeah. I think that it's such a niche market now, CDs, that it is a thing, but it's mostly a thing for people who are just nostalgic about it as a format, like that are like my age or something, or,
Yeah, it's kind of like the vinyl people too, right? It's just a nostalgia thing. In that same article, you had also mentioned that, in your opinion, mastering is all about creating cohesion between all of the tracks on a record. And I'd love to dive into that a little bit too. Like, how do you go about creating that cohesiveness? Like, what kind of stuff are you ultimately listening for? And then how do you go about making that cohesiveness?
Yeah, good question. So, I mean, first of all, with anything I'm doing, I try to follow like the Hippocratic Oath, which is at least first do no harm, right? So, I'm trying to kind of preserve what's great about the mixes and, respect the intent of the artist and the producer and the mixing engineer. And then from there, when I am working on a project that's an EP or an album, you want to make it sound like a record. Like when you're mastering a single, like you can kind of do whatever you want. It's living in its own world. It's a one-off thing. And, you might get a specific brief from the client where they wanted loud or they wanted brighter, and you can do all of that. When you're mastering, a 10-song record, you want to try to find the balance point tonally and dynamically that all of these different mixes can be adjusted to sit within that range. So whether and some of the time the mixes are already really consistent, but some of the time you maybe have 5 mixes that are kind of like that are tonally like middle of the road and they're all consistent, and then you might have a couple mixes that are much brighter and a couple mixes that are much that have much more low end. In that case, it's kind of obvious unless those. So you're trying to bring the bright mixes down tonally to the middle range, and you're trying to tame the low end on those bassy ones to get to the majority place. And at other times, you have mixes that are kind of all over the place. And so in that case, you kind of need to choose the song that is going to be like maybe the sonic template. So you have to like bring everything to where that song is, and that might require some collaboration or conversation with the artist or whoever's in charge. But it really is about getting the songs tonally from an EQ standpoint all in the same ballpark, so it's not jarring when you move from song to song. And then you also have to get the songs into the same relative like average loudness. The thing is that what's more important than that is that the transitions from song to song feel good, right? So like there are cases where you might need, in order to make song number 2 sound natural coming out of song number 1, the intro, because that transition from the fade out of song 1 to the intro of song 2 needs to feel good. So that's where you need to worry about like how to adjust the average loudness of each of those songs so that the transition feels good. You might end up with a chorus in song 2 that sounds way louder than the chorus in song 1, and then you've got to like make macro adjustments for everything else. So there's a lot of small adjustments. You need to make some judgment calls. I don't really love to like automate the volume of individual sections of songs too much, because I feel like that is changing the vision of the artist and the mixing engineer. So I try to do as much as possible with like kind of adjustments at the song level for tonally and average loudness to make those transitions all feel good and feel like it's like kind of a single piece. Mm-hmm. And then, so sonically, those are the considerations. And obviously there's a bunch of like file prep and like quality control stuff that goes into preparing the deliverables so that they are workable down the road for manufacturing and all of that. So those are all the considerations when you're working on a record, like instead of a single,
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that if you start automating like a verse and a chorus and all that kind of stuff, then you're really taking away from that natural dynamic that the artist liked in the initial mix. So it really is more about that average listening experience. Do you find yourself like maybe listening to like the chorus of song 1, the chorus of song 2, that kind of thing, and like comparing like the loudest parts of the song against each other?
Yeah, that's where I start always, is like once I've got the tonal stuff working right and I'm getting into like really a lot of the dynamics and the loudness stuff, I do first compare the loudest sections of songs to get them in the ballpark. That's my starting point, and I'll check the transitions and see if that works. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's a lot of it is a judgment call, and it's more about feel, you know what I mean? But you need a starting point, and that's where I start, is getting the loudest sections of the songs in the same ballpark.
Of course. Yeah. And you talked about how, part of your role in mastering is to preserve that mix as much as possible. And some people might argue that like, if you're, boosting the low end in a mix to make it sound bigger to match, the song before, that kind of thing, then you're changing the mix. But I'm assuming that a lot of these changes you're making, they often just need to be subtle. You're not getting too crazy with a lot of the bigger moves. Yeah, I'm really a conservative mixing engineer. I'm kind of old school in that way. But it's worked for me. And so like, I'm talking about, unless something's really egregious, like I'll be high passing or shelving like the subs, and because somebody just mixed it, they didn't have a mixing environment that was really revealing those frequencies, so I have a good listening environment, good monitoring, and I use a lot of visual tools to like double check my work too, to make sure that there's nothing weird that I really need to clean up. But the moves that I'm making are typically not super drastic, Mm-hmm. I'm assuming they're fairly pretty broad.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah, because I like there are times when, for whatever reason, like a cymbal on a track, like the crashes are not cutting through, and every other track has these loud brash cymbals, and you've got to like really notch and kind of like find the frequency to bring the cymbals out or whatever, or take something out. But now there's even like great dynamic tools that are, have AI assistance, or you can, are much more dynamic, like as opposed to just notching a frequency with an EQ. There's lots of dynamic EQ or multi-band compression, multi-band limiting that is dynamic, that can help you with that stuff now.
Mm-hmm. Do you use any of those AI tools in your mastering process?
Not a lot. What I try to do is, if I'm working in a genre I'm not as familiar with, or I'm just looking to double check my work, like there are some good AI tools that have kind of recommendations for different genres for like the loudness range of a specific section of the frequency band. It's really just like double checking my work that I kind of might leverage that stuff. And I've just been dipping my toe into that because it's still a pretty nascent technology, that I don't trust our robot overlords very much yet. I just think that you got to stay on top of the technology and understand it,
Yeah. Well, it sounds like the AI tools that you're using are more like from
It's like metering, yeah, mostly metering, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like you're running it through like Lander or something like that, and
no,
letting that master your song.
No, never. And like I've messed around with like AI EQs and stuff from Sonable and everything, but it didn't sound right to me at all. It's really not there yet, and maybe it'll get there. But for metering, it's really good. Maybe for adjusting overall levels, like you could kind of use it as a starting point for, just I mean, there are good tools for like calculating overall RMS across the whole track and things like that. It's like quality control and metering. Gotcha. I think it's really helpful for right now.
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make, right? So that people don't just think like, oh, well, I heard him talk about AI tools. I'm just going to let it do whatever it does. And, that helps, right? But it's like, no, when you're using these AI tools to help you with like overall balance and that kind of stuff, that's way more helpful than it just applying random processing to your mix and, hoping it sounds better, I guess,
Yeah, I mean, but at the same time, I think people should do whatever they want. If they get the results they want by using like SoundCloud mastering service, then good for them. Like, I think that a lot of times that works for people because they don't have the experience to know better. You know what I mean? They don't know what's possible, and maybe their ear isn't as developed as somebody who's got 30 years of experience in working with audio, and but with 200,000 new songs a day coming through Spotify, it probably doesn't matter that most of them don't sound as good as they could. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of hit songs that don't sound right to me. But what I'm concentrating on is like sticking to my values and my taste and working with and serving the community that is in tune with what I know. And so there's still a lot of people making music that are striving for certain standards, and they have like taste that is informed by the 50 years of record making that we've got so far.
Of course. Well, taste is definitely one reason to hire an engineer, because you're going to get their taste. Yeah. And it kind of reminded me of a question that I wanted to ask you, which was that, when I was listening to your Spotify playlist that you've got on your website and, all the different examples of your portfolio, one thing that did stand out to me that I thought sounded cool was that a lot of your mixes and your masters, they do typically seem like a little bit darker than, the typical modern pop or rock song. And so I was curious about that. Like, is that something that is just a personal taste of yours, or is that something that is usually dictated more by the productions that you're working on? Mm-hmm. And by dark, I don't mean that in a bad way.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Like they said, they weren't harsh like a lot of the modern pop songs that you hear, right?
Yeah. A lot of the stuff I've done probably has kind of, maybe some rounder low end and even prominent low end, not sub lows, but like, low end, and doesn't have hyped high end. And so I think that does come out of my background is more kind of in, my taste was really shaped in an analog era. And I also come from a background of like underground music, and that might be, it's like indie rock. I like a lot of like original lo-fi version 1 music, which was stuff recorded on cassette, which has a kind of a roll off in the highs, and so that is more of a taste thing. Like the way I listen to music and what I like is just a little bit rounder sounding and maybe a little bit squishier sounding. And also most of the music that I've gotten in has or a lot of it has, the mixes have sounded like that. Like I would never want to crank the highs by 8 dB or something like that just because it's closer to what's on the radio. Again, it's respecting the vision of the artist and the producer, the creative people, that their mixes sound like this, and I want to preserve that and present it to the world. And I'm not their A&R guy who wants to make it pop on the radio unless they tell me that something was wrong in our monitoring environment. Like, these are way darker than we want. Can you do something about it? So it's a combination of taste and also, just respecting what's come my way as far as source material,
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I think, at this point in your career, you've worked with so many artists that people now know what your sound is, or your taste, and what to expect from you. So it kind of makes sense that artist that's looking for that super bright, harsh sounding top end is probably not going to go with you. And that's a good thing, right? Like, you're going to go to that person who's going to specialize in doing that. Right. So you kind of attract the people that you want to work with and that are going to have that sound that you want to work with as well. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, we covered a lot of ground already as far as your process with like loudness and balancing and all that kind of stuff. Maybe in some ways we jumped ahead of one of the questions I always like to ask people, which is like, how do you get started with your masters to begin with? Like, when you have a new project, what are some of the first things that you typically do with that track?
Well, I definitely listen to it. I think that my process has really evolved over time quite a bit. But I think that one of the first things I'll do is kind of clean up the tips and tails of all of the files. Like, a lot of the times there might be lots of lead time or extra space at the end or whatever. I try to clean up, the tracks. If there's a huge variability in the average volume, just like even visually with the track, sometimes you'll get like a record that was recorded at, over the course of 5 years or at different studios, different mixing engineers. Maybe I'll adjust the gain of some of the clips, like the audio files themselves, to bring them a little bit more into the same ballpark to where the transients are kind of like looking similar. Just so that when I first listen, they're going to be a little bit more uniform, and that, so that if I find settings or whatever that work for some of the songs, that I can use them as a starting point on other songs or things like that. So
are you normalizing your tracks at that stage, or is it kind of just like a fader thing? Or
no, I've never used automated normalization up front, because I don't think that I mean, if we're just talking about like linear normalization, that's looking at the kind of the transients, I don't think that's that valuable. I'm kind of just going by gut, like making these adjustments, having with the amount of experience I have. Also, if I might start laying them out, I have different types of workflows that I mess with, but I might like lay them out on different tracks linearly so I can start listening to the transitions, or I might keep them all at 0 in the timeline. I have different ways of doing things that I experiment all the time. So mostly it's like I do cleanup. I try to identify if any of the songs are like at a different bit depth or resolution. I kind of like try to get all my ducks in a row before I really start working on any audio, by determining if there's any quality control issues. Like, maybe the song is obviously cut off at the end, and I want to try to, like, if I need any more corrections or new files from the client, I want to get that done as early in the process as possible, because I don't want to like miss a deadline or anything like that. So, getting my template set up, making sure that all the files seem right, and getting them into a position where, like, when I'm ready to start working, I can just kind of hit the ground running,
Of course. You mentioned templates. Do you have like specific tools that you generally like to use, or a template that you typically work off of? Or
yeah, I do have mastering templates in the DAWs that I use. So I have like outboard gear, and I have a few things that I do just in the box. So like, I think most of us are doing like the digital, the final limiting in the box these days, and then maybe like linear phase EQ maybe in the box and things like that. So I do have templates that have the tools, the in the box tools that I'm using nowadays. And I still haven't settled on like a particular limiter. Like I'm always trying different things, but and then every 6 months or so, I'll save a new template with kind of like whatever I've been using most recently. For a long time, but it's tough. Like I still use a number of different DAWs for different purposes. You know, like I did a lot of my mastering with Logic as the main platform for a while, but I'm really like an Ableton Live guy, so I've been trying to make Ableton work for a lot of the audio processing and kind of main capture software. So I've been trying to make that work recently, and I like it. Like I think Ableton actually sounds really good. Like I've done some A/Bing between lots of different DAWs, and it might be placebo effect, but the playback engine in Ableton is what I'm used to at this point, and I like that. I still have to use other software if I'm creating a DDP or I'm doing different kinds of like file preparation or delivery, but for a lot of the audio stuff, I'm using Ableton because it's kind of what I'm used to and where I'm comfortable.
For sure. And I think that that's a really important point to bring up too, is that, you know, you have to work with whatever you're most comfortable with.
Yeah.
For myself, like I did all my mastering in Logic for years. And then I had all those other programs to do the DDPs and embed CD text and all that kind of stuff. And only recently did I switch over to using Wavelab, and it's been such a hard transition for me because I'm just so like, although I can do everything in one program, it's just like learning a whole new language almost, you know?
Yeah, I've tried Wavelab. I've tried a lot, most of the different mastering software that's available, all of the different DAWs. The thing that I've found is that none of them have everything that I need, right? So it's like I need to find the one that is fastest for me. And then I've had to create my own workflows for some of the stuff that I do, whether that is just my way of thinking about my order of operations and how I like to export things. I want to be able to rename bulk files. I want to do a lot of automation stuff. I want to be able to, like, you know, freeze files without having to bounce them or whatever it is. I haven't found any software that really fits the bill for me. And so I think for my workflow, I still use like kind of a multi-track DAW software. And then I have like a lot of the time it's like assembly and file prep and stuff is a separate process for me, you know? Mm-hmm. So I haven't been able to find like mastering software that allows me to do the audio and all the file prep and delivery stuff. It's just like the audio stuff is clunky in the mastering software. And then like the file prep stuff is clunky in the DAWs, you know? So it's kind of annoying, but I think the only solution would be for me to like design and build my own software, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah. So, you know, when it comes to using what I guess a lot of people would consider a non-mastering DAW, whether that's Logic or Ableton, that kind of thing, you know, I think one argument that a lot of mastering engineers will make for a program like Wavelab or a mastering DAW is that, you know, you have things like your clip processing and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, just the way it lays it out and, you know, 2 tracks, you can, you know, stagger things and that kind of thing, where you can't really do that as much in Logic or Ableton. So are you just basically copying all of your plugins onto every channel and then every channel is its own song, that kind of thing? Is that how it would typically work for you?
Yeah, I have a different track for every song. And then I'll have like you know, if I'm using the same limiter on every song, I'll have that plug-in on every one of those tracks. And yeah, that's just how I address it. Yeah, and because the way that I'm used to thinking about audio processing as well is how it's laid out in a DAW. You know, you have like your plug-in channels. And like a channel strip type of interface, and just the routing and the interface and how plugins, it's mostly like the user interface and user experience that is really familiar to me and fast, because, you know, I am an artist and I'm working, I do a lot of writing and recording and mixing, and in a traditional DAW, and my work, I'm really fast at it. And so for me to have a totally different type of workflow in mastering, which is all I'm doing is listening to and manipulating and editing audio. Like if mastering is, 50% of my time in working with audio, and the rest of it is like as an artist and stuff, to do that total context switching and go to a totally different system, it doesn't work for me. Like I feel like mastering something like Ableton Live, like and knowing the ins and outs of it, and even being able to get creative with some of its advanced features, or maybe some plugins that are not typically used for mastering, because I have experience with them in my creative work. It's kind of like, it's a no-brainer for me. Like this is kind of my domain,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, again, it's just that speed is definitely a big part of it, and just being comfortable. How long do you think it normally takes you to finish mastering a song on average?
Oh, an individual, yeah, it would be tough to say. Like it's really all over the map. Like, and I don't keep track of it either. That's something I probably should do that's something I should probably know, but I have no idea.
I always find like if you're doing a single, it always takes a lot longer because you're like really focused on that song, or at least like the first song you master on an album, and then the rest of them typically go much faster because you've kind of already established that template, right? But
yeah, I think that sounds right. Yeah, I would say that's accurate.
Right on, man. Well, I guess to wrap things up, I'd love to ask you, in your opinion, what ultimately makes a great mastered mix?
Well, it depends on the context. Like a great mastered mix in the context of an album is something that makes the album cohesive and is appropriate for that context. So that's something very specific. Like when you're mastering an album, it's not necessarily about making each individual song sound the best possible. Because it depends, like the instrumentation and the mix and the sonic quality or characteristics can be so all over the map. So with an album, you're thinking about the whole, and you want the whole to be as strong as possible. And there are different considerations, compromises, choices made along the way to make a cohesive and maximal quality whole, like maximal impact. For a single, you can concentrate more on maximizing what that individual song, individual mix is trying to accomplish. And so I try to approach it as a listener, and from the perspective of a listener, like maximizing the emotional impact of the song. So making the big parts big, making if it's an acoustic track, trying to preserve the intimacy of it. So it's finding what the song is trying to accomplish, maybe what the lyrics are saying, what the emotional quality of it is, and trying to maximize that and serve the song.
I love that. That's such a great answer, and I totally agree with you. And I think it's really great that you brought up that point that it's not about necessarily making the song the absolute best it can, because and I think that's what everyone expects it to be, right? But it really is more about that bigger picture, that actual experience of like, how does this butt up against another song, and what's that experience like? Because I think if you were to master all of those songs in isolation and make them sound the best they can, that might be great from like a singles perspective, but when you are listening to that album, you're gonna have such a hard time listening to it because it's not gonna flow well, right?
It's not a record. It's not going to sound like a record. And I've heard many records, even going back to the CD days, where there's one song that maybe it was the single or whatever, but it sticks out like a sore thumb because it's like way, way brighter than everything else. And for me, that really ruins the experience of listening to the album. And, I'm an old guy, I'm an old fashioned person, I guess, but I still listen to albums, and So when I'm talking about that approach, it really is in the context of albums, trying to make the best album possible. And it doesn't necessarily apply to just I have different approaches for standalone singles and albums because I love albums,
Yeah. No, that makes sense. But it's very similar to like how mixing engineers, you're not mixing to make it sound the best it can in your specific room.
Right.
You need to be mixing so that it's going to be something that translates well. And that's ultimately that experience that people listen to, right? Like they're not listening in your room with your treated system and amazing speakers and this and that. Like you're ultimately just trying to make something that is kind of that status quo that people are expecting, I guess,
It's an average. Yeah, I would refer to it as like the average listening environment. You want it to sound as good as possible, and you want it to still translate in your average listening environment. I think it's dangerous to cater to the lowest common denominator. Like, got to make sure it sounds good on listening on the phone speakers. Mm-hmm. Because it's just not realistic to get bass frequencies coming out of that. But you do want it to sound right, or you don't want it to sound out of place or unusual in your average listening environment. So, yeah, I mean, like I said, with mastering, it's about averaging out all these different considerations, whether that's mediums, like media, like vinyl versus CD versus digital versus YouTube, and then all of the potential listening environments. So it's a lot of that has to do more with quality control and than anything else. And so it's an art and a science, both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love it. I think that's a phenomenal answer there. So thank you for that. Well, TW, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed learning a lot about your process, and I think you gave us some really clear answers as to how you go about things and why you do that. I think that's really important for people to be able to take this information and actually apply it to their own tracks. So thank you for that. If people want to learn more about you or potentially follow you online, maybe even hire you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, my website is twwalsh.com, and you can read about what I've got going on as an artist. I've also done a few remixes for other artists recently, and get in touch with me about mastering there at twwalsh.com. I'm also twwalsh on Instagram and Twitter. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, right on, man. Thank you again for everything.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
So that was my interview with T.W. Walsh, and I really enjoyed that. I thought that he was very articulate with his answers, and I think that if you're someone who didn't really understand much about the mastering process prior to this episode, you certainly should have learned a lot. And I think that it was really interesting to learn why he does things the way he does, despite the fact that on the surface, some of those things might sound counterintuitive. But what he talked about here is exactly what mastering engineers are focused on. They're really focused on creating that ultimate experience for the listener. And sometimes that means that you got to go louder than what Spotify recommends. Sometimes that means that you have to change the EQ of a mix to make an album sound more consistent. And sometimes that means that the song isn't going to always sound the absolute best that it can. But by creating the bigger picture experience, that's the thing that people are really going to enjoy much more than just a whole bunch of random songs that are at different levels, different EQs, all that kind of stuff. You have to be thinking about that bigger picture. And that's really what mastering engineers focus on. So yeah, I thought it was really great to hear it come from him and to just explain the thought process behind it. And it's not just about following the quote unquote rules that, the industry tells you that you're supposed to follow. Sometimes you need to stray outside of that path to ultimately create a better experience, a better product. So yeah, I really enjoyed that episode. I hope that you did too. If you did enjoy this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast. That way you're notified about even more episodes like this as they go live each and every Wednesday morning. And if you're someone that's looking for additional help with your mixes, heck, maybe you're looking for mastering, make sure to check out MasterYourMix.com. And on that website, I've got a ton of great resources designed to help you out. There are coaching programs if you're looking for one-on-one support with your mixes. If you're looking for someone to master your tracks, that is something that I can also help you out with as well. So again, if you visit MasterYourMix.com, there's a services section on there, and that'll take you to a site where you can tell me a little bit more about your project. And I'd love to work with you and master your tracks so that you can get more music out in the wild. So yeah, again, make sure to visit MasterYourMix.com. There are a ton of great resources there to help you out. And at the end of the day, my goal with this podcast and my goal with that website is to help people put out more music and to feel proud of the work that you're releasing. So, that is why I do what I do. And if you're in need of help, MasterYourMix.com, that's the place to go. All right, guys, with that said, we have reached the end of this episode. Thank you so much for sticking around to the very end, and I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Later. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit MasterYourMix.com.